So I've got this a very potted history. I'm not being historian by any stretch here, of games play in the Holocaust. So I know that in some of the later presentations, there'll be some thoughts about play and games and what the differences or distinctions about these are, how nuanced we might be. But I thought I'd just start with some examples of playful experiences that aren't kind of computer games. And some of these include Train, the board game, and the designer of which will hopefully be joining us in February. The very two quite controversial art installations in their time, the Lego Auschwitz project and Your Colouring Book, where people are invited to come and colour in the book, which is at the top of the screen there. And then Lego stop motion, kind of short film, stop motion films that were made on YouTube by school children. And many of these were made as school projects. So they were, in some cases, students were asked, for example, in RE lessons to write or create something in response to their lessons on the Holocaust. And some students had decided to use Lego as their medium in which to do this. And obviously more recently, the Minecraft kind of open world space has instigated quite a few examples of, again, young people creating Holocaust architecture and Holocaust spaces. So I'll move on to computer games then. Wolfenstein is perhaps the example that a lot of people have come to when they think about the Holocaust. It's not really about the Holocaust. The Holocaust isn't really centralized in it. And it was one of the first ever first-person shooter computer games, and involved shooting up Nazis, right? And of course, this is positioned in a much wider culture of the Nazi as the ultimate monster, the ultimate villain, which became popular in lots of different genres in popular culture. And some examples here of that are Indiana Jones, Invaders of the Lost Ark, an adventure film, to the space Nazis of the sci-fi Iron Sky, and then to neo-Nazi surfers in the Troma classic Surf Nazis Must Die. Not historical Nazis, but still kind of the idea of the Nazis is the bad guy still persists, even in cult, low-budget films. And then I'm kind of very vaguely calling this kind of next period is from silence to condemnation. So we have quite a long period where people aren't really considering computer games as a medium for Holocaust memory or history particularly. But attention does get drawn to games like KZ Manager, or Holocaust Tycoon, and the fact that neo-Nazis are using the kind of models of kind of tycoon simulation games or world-building games for their own political agendas. And some of these images hit the mainstream when gameplay is shared on YouTube. And it kind of feels here like the fate of Holocaust computer games gets sealed because the only ones that seem to exist at that time are neo-Nazi games. So obviously computer games are bad, right? So, end of conversation. Let's not talk about it anymore. But what we end up with though is kind of a grassroots kind of amateur development where the Holocaust is becoming a subject of games in quite a kind of a potted way. And I think what's really interesting is what this shows us about game culture more widely. So the games distribution platform Steam allows anyone to upload content, rather than like PlayStation and other game consoles where you have to have a particular games license to have access to their systems. And you have Don't Starve as part of a game jam in Israel. A mod is created for it called Don't Starve in the Holocaust. And a Sonic Commander Revolt mod is made for Wolfenstein. And the makers of the latter were really widely and harshly condemned, and the Israeli Anti-Defamation League came down on them really hard. And I know the maker has kind of regretted making this film because of the impact it's had on his life. And there's a really great film that looks into what happens with that particular example called Another Planet, and it looks at the Wolfenstein mod in relation to lots of other kind of virtualizations of camps. And then a professional independent game designer tries to raise money on Indiegogo for a fantasy game rooted in a particular historical moment during the Holocaust. And then it's perhaps no surprise that his attempt is not only unsuccessful, but that the international press jumps on him after all this kind of hysteria that we've had around the Sonic Commander mod. And that game was Imagination is the Only Escape. And again, the maker will be joining us in February. So we hear echoes of Elie Wiesel's decree of trivialization about NBC's Holocaust here, and the criticism that returned with Maus, Schindler's List, Life is Beautiful, and a myriad of other popular cultural texts that dared engage with this past. But those texts that were once really condemned are often now part of the Holocaust canon in academia and courses about Holocaust representation. So perhaps computer games would also be more prominent in future discussions too. And some of you may be particularly familiar with Call of Duty World War II. So the Holocaust becomes kind of more mainstream in a game in this example. I'm not going to talk about it too much. Both Kate Marison and Tabir Weidman have written wonderful blogs for the Digital Holocaust Memory site on this game. But it raises some interesting questions about the relationship between what is a game and the playability. So when you go into this particular site that has the kind of Holocaust iconography, you have to follow the non-player characters. So you can't use a weapon anymore. Kate has argued that this repeats the taboos about the representability of the Holocaust. And is it putting the Holocaust into a game without gaming the Holocaust? And there's been some interesting chatter on her blog about this earlier today. So I kind of want to leave with just a few kind of points and questions really. And the first one of these is around the language we use and what are these? So, games, I think one of the fears around games and the Holocaust is not just about trivialization, the potential for distortion, but about the perception that players get kind of much more control and choice over the destiny of history. And I know there's a huge amount of work in history and game studies about the significance of the counterfactual. Games can, and not always, but can involve incorporation into particular game worlds through rules. So there's a potential here for interpolation in interactive and immersive digital experiences, as much as there is in historical broadcast media form. So the idea of kind of digital as this kind of radical, participatory, interactive mediums and forms, etc., is perhaps an over-exaggeration. The other word I'm always kind of really hesitant about is gamification. So I've often heard people in museums talk about wanting to gamify experiences. But for me, from a media and cultural studies perspective, when we think about gamification, we look at it in the context of how businesses cultivate neoliberal consumers through gamifications. That it's about not only promoting business objectives, but promoting certain kinds of repetitive behavior that get your consumers to consume more generally, but to be the kind of consumers you want them to be. It's like, is that necessarily the intention? But I think kind of an overlooked area of games cultures in terms of kind of thinking about how Holocaust scholarship and practice thinks about games is that the culture of games isn't just about the gamer's text. It is this constant intertextuality, referentiality, and imaginative responses to others' creations, particularly through platforms like Steam now, the culture of modding and its long roots in hacking and games jams. These do not attempt to give individuals agency, but they recognize that everyone already has it and respects that anyone can come and be creative and respond to content that's already out there. And I've put there a kind of scale there. We've been talking about this today at work in a design sprint, that you're always kind of negotiating somewhere between agency and control. Media, including games, aren't automatically going to give players 100% agency, or you can't 100% control them. But we always need to think about, in any example, the negotiation between those two things. So there's more Holocaust games today. And this seems like a really important moment to start taking this more seriously. And some examples there, and I've put them on the Padlet that I shared at the beginning, and I'll share it again in the chat when I've finished speaking. Our Attendant 1942, The Forgotten Ones, My Memory of Us, and Through the Darkest Times. So I'm just going to leave with some questions that I'm not going to answer, but a kind of question mark over, are there any institutional Holocaust games? And my question is, there are lots of digital projects emerging in the Holocaust context, in the kind of institutional Holocaust memory. Can we understand any of these projects in the context of gaming? Are Holocaust organizations already encouraging visitors to play with the Holocaust or game with the Holocaust, even when there continues to be hesitation about the medium of games? And how do we understand these terms, gaming, games, and play? Do we need to reevaluate what we think these mean in different contexts? And what can we learn from the very interdisciplinary audience, for example, that we have here today, about different ways people interpret these terms? Some examples I've put there, and this is a question mark, I'm not saying any of these are games, is the VR experience of the Anne Frank house. the Kristallnacht exhibition in Second Life by United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, the interactive story journey app by the National Holocaust Centre in the UK, and the Auschwitz app by the Auschwitz Jewish Centre in Oswiecim in Poland. So I will stop sharing my screen there.